Story number 1. The Shadow on the Peak. Mount Grayspine was supposed to be our adventure. One last hurrah before life pulled us in different directions. We talked about it for months, making plans over beers in dimly lit college bars. Chris, Jenna, Alex, and I had always been the adventurous type, the kind of people who sought out challenges most would shy away from. A midwinter ascent of a mountain known for its treacherous conditions and breathtaking views seemed like the perfect way to cap off our friendship before the real world swallowed us whole. We didn't realize the mountain had plans of its own. The trailhead was buried under a thin layer of snow when we arrived that morning. The trees silent and heavy with frost. The air was crisp, each breath leaving a visible plume, and the sky was a flawless shade of blue. We were buzzing with excitement, our packs heavy with gear but our spirits light. The climb to the summit was supposed to take 2 days, one day to the halfway camp, another to the peak and back down. Straightforward, challenging, but manageable. The first day went off without a hitch. We laughed and joked as we climbed, stopping occasionally to take in the stunning vistas. By late afternoon, we'd reached the midway point, a flat, open area sheltered by a cluster of pine trees. We pitched our tents, built a small fire, and sat around it, the warmth seeping into our bones as the sun dipped behind the mountains. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags, the wind began to howl. It started as a low whistle, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like a living thing, wailing and moaning as it tore through the trees. I remember lying there, staring at the fabric of the tent illuminated by the flickering firelight, feeling an unease I couldn't quite place. It wasn't the wind itself, it was something beneath it, a faint, rhythmic sound I couldn't identify. I told myself it was nothing. I didn't sleep. We set out early the next morning, the snow crunching under our boots as we climbed higher into the mountains. The wind had eased, leaving behind a brittle silence that seemed to press against my ears. The trail was harder to follow now, buried under fresh snow, but Alex was confident in his navigation. He led the way, his headlamp cutting through the pre-dawn gloom. By mid-morning, the first signs of something strange began to appear. Jenna was the first to notice it, massive footprints in the snow, leading up the trail ahead of us. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen, each print at least twice the size of a human foot, with long, claw-like indentations at the tips of the toes. The stride was enormous, far larger than any human or animal I could think of. "What the hell made these?" Chris asked, crouching to examine one of the prints. "Bear," Jenna suggested, though her voice was uncertain. "Bears don't walk like this," Alex said, his face pale. "And they're hibernating this time of year." We exchanged uneasy glances, but there was no turning back now. The summit was within reach, and none of us wanted to admit we were scared, so we pressed on, the footprints guiding us up the trail like some twisted beacon. By the time we reached the summit, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. The view was breathtaking, an endless expanse of jagged peaks and deep valleys stretching out in every direction. But the air was colder up here, the kind of cold that bites deep and doesn't let go. And then we saw it. First, it was just a shadow, a faint, hulking silhouette standing at the far edge of the peak. But as we moved closer, it became clear that this wasn't a rock or a tree. It was a figure, impossibly tall and broad, its form too angular, too wrong to be human. It stood perfectly still, his back to us, as though it were waiting for something. "What is that?" Jenna whispered, her voice trembling. None of us answered. We were frozen in place, our breath fogging in the icy air as we stared at the figure. My stomach churned, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Alex raised his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thin mountain air. The moment it touched the figure, turned. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, an absence of light and form that seemed to consume everything around it. The edges of its silhouette flickered and writhed like smoke. And though it had no eyes, I felt its gaze pierce straight through me. A low, guttural sound rumbled from the figure, reverberating through my chest like a physical blow. "Run," Chris whispered, his voice barely audible. We didn't need to be told twice. We turned and bolted, our boots slipping and sliding on the icy trail as we fled. The wind howled around us, carrying with it a faint, mocking laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I didn't look back, couldn't bear to see if it was following. All I could do was run, my lungs burning and my heart pounding in my ears. When we finally reached the base of the mountain, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the snow. We collapsed in a heap near the trailhead, gasping for breath, our faces pale and our bodies trembling. None of us spoke, the silence between us heavier than the air around us. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, we found the footprints again, circling our camp. They were fresh, the impressions deep and clear in the soft snow. But there was no sign of whatever had made them, no trace of the shadow that had haunted us on the peak. We never talked about what happened that night, not to each other, not to anyone, but sometimes, late at night, I hear the wind howl, and I think about the figure on the ridge, its void-like face and the way it turned toward us, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting for someone else to climb the mountain. Story number 2. The Endless Path. They say the forest has a way of playing tricks on you, that the trees can whisper lies, and the shadows can make you see things that aren't there. I used to laugh at those stories, chalking them up to superstition or overactive imaginations. That was before the day Ian and I walked the Endless Path. It was supposed to be a simple hike. Ian and I had been best friends since college, and our shared love of the outdoors had seen us tackle trails all across the country. The plan was to spend the weekend exploring a lesser-known forest preserve we'd read about online, a place that promised solitude, beauty, and a challenge. It was a cool autumn morning when we set out, the leaves a riot of red and gold under a pale blue sky. The trail started innocently enough, winding through groves of towering pines and past trickling streams. We talked and laughed, the crunch of leaves underfoot a steady rhythm to our banter. But as the hours passed, the forest began to change. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches interlocking overhead to block out the sun. The air grew colder, carrying a faint, metallic scent that made my skin prickle. The trail, once well-marked and easy to follow, became narrow and uneven, the dirt path swallowed by creeping undergrowth. "Are we still on the map?" Ian asked, his voice laced with unease. I pulled out my phone, but the GPS was useless. The signal had disappeared miles ago, leaving us with only a crude paper map that suddenly seemed inadequate. "I think so," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Let's keep going," Ian said. "The trail has to loop back eventually." So we walked, and walked, and walked. The first time we realized something was wrong. It was subtle. A feeling of déjà vu, the nagging sense that we'd passed the same tree or rock formation before. We brushed it off as our imaginations, convincing ourselves that the forest just looked similar in every direction. But then we passed the fallen tree. It was unmistakable, its massive trunk split down the middle, the wood rotting and covered in moss. We'd passed it hours ago, and yet here it was again, as though it had moved to meet us. "That's not possible," Ian said, staring at the tree with wide eyes. "We've been walking in a straight line. Maybe we missed a turn," I suggested, though my voice wavered. "Let's backtrack and find the trailhead." We turned around and retraced our steps, the forest eerily silent around us. The light had started to fade, the shadows growing long and deep. The path became harder to follow, twisting and splitting in ways it hadn't before. And then we saw it again, the fallen tree. Panic set in. Ian swore, kicking at the dirt, while I tried to make sense of the map. Nothing added up. The forest was toying with us, bending the rules of space and logic. We argued about what to do. Stay put and wait for help, or keep moving and hope for a break in the trees. Neither option felt safe. That's when we heard the laughter. It was faint at first, a soft, lilting sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. We froze, our eyes darting around the forest. The laughter grew louder, more distinct, and my stomach turned when I realized it wasn't the laughter of a single person. It was a chorus, dozens of voices overlapping, rising and falling in a twisted, mocking harmony. "Who's there?" Ian shouted, his voice cracking. "Show yourself." The laughter stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the trees leaning in as if to listen. And then we saw it. A shadow moved between the trees, tall and thin, its form impossible to define. It didn't walk so much as glide, its movements jerky and unnatural. I couldn't see its face, if it had one, but I felt its gaze, cold and piercing, like icy fingers digging into my chest. "It's coming closer," Ian whispered, his voice barely audible. "Run," I said. We ran, the forest a blur around us. The trail, or what was left of it, twisted and turned, leading us deeper into the trees. The shadow followed, always just at the edge of my vision, its presence an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing through the forest like a taunt. It seemed to come from every direction, weaving around us, driving us forward. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare stop. Not until we reached the clearing. We stumbled into it without warning, the dense trees giving way to an open expanse bathed in eerie moonlight. The ground was bare, the dirt cracked and dry despite the cool, damp air. In the center of the clearing stood an old, crumbling stone marker, its surface covered in strange, unreadable symbols. Ian doubled over, gasping for breath. What the hell is this place?" "I don't know," I said, my voice trembling. "But I don't think we're supposed to be here." The laughter stopped again, replaced by a deep, unnatural silence. The shadow stood at the edge of the clearing, its form shifting and flickering like smoke caught in a windless void. It didn't move, but its presence filled the space, pressing against us like a physical force. And then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was a low, guttural growl, layered with an unnatural echo that made my skin crawl. The words weren't spoken so much as felt, vibrating through my bones. "Let's go," Ian said, grabbing my arm. We didn't wait for permission. We ran back into the forest, the shadow's laughter chasing us, his words lingering in my mind like a scar. We found the trailhead just as dawn broke, the first rays of sunlight cutting through the trees. The forest seemed normal again, the twisted paths and endless loops gone as though they'd never existed. We didn't stop running until we reached the car, slamming the doors shut behind us. We never spoke about what happened, not to each other, not to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the laughter again, faint and far away, like an echo from a dream, and I wonder if the forest is still waiting, its endless path ready to swallow someone else. Story number 3. The cabin in the woods. When you think of getting lost in the woods, you imagine it as a story you'll tell later, laughing about how you took a wrong turn and stumbled onto some scenic detour. That's what we thought, too, until we found the cabin. It was late October, and the forest was quiet in the way that warns of winter's approach. The leaves had already fallen, carpeting the ground in shades of orange and brown, their crisp crunch underfoot the only sound for miles. My friends Jack, Sarah, Emily, and I had planned this trip as a last hurrah before the cold set in. A weekend of hiking and camping in the untouched wilderness. We hadn't planned on losing the trail. It started innocently enough. We'd set out early that morning, maps and compasses in hand, confident in our abilities. The first few hours were perfect, clear skies, brisk air, and nothing but the vast expanse of forest stretching out before us. But as the day wore on, The terrain grew unfamiliar. The trail markers we'd been following vanished, and the trees seemed to close in around us. "We're not lost," Jack insisted, studying the map with furrowed brows. "The trail's just overgrown. We've been walking in circles," Sarah said, her voice sharp with frustration. "I swear I saw that tree an hour ago." "We should head back," Emily suggested, glancing nervously at the lengthening shadows. "We can find our way in the morning." But by then, the light was fading, and the forest had become a maze of identical trees and shifting shadows. The air grew colder, the kind of chill that seeps into your bones. Just as panic was beginning to set in, we saw it, a cabin, tucked away in a small clearing. The cabin was old, its wooden walls weathered and gray, the roof sagging under the weight of time. It looked abandoned, the kind of place that had been forgotten long ago. But it was shelter, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, we had little choice. "This is creepy," Sarah muttered as we approached. "It's just an old cabin," Jack said, trying to sound confident. "Better than freezing out here." The door creaked loudly as Jack pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. The single room was sparsely furnished, an old table, a couple of chairs, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't seen a flame in years. A ladder in the corner led up to a small loft, its wooden planks warped and uneven. "Cozy," Emily said, her attempt at humor falling flat. We built a fire in the fireplace, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. As the warmth spread through the room, we started to relax, telling ourselves it was just a cabin, just a place to sleep until morning. We couldn't have been more wrong. It started with the footsteps. I woke sometime after midnight to a soft, rhythmic sound, heavy, deliberate steps on the roof. My breath caught in my throat as I listened, the sound moving slowly from one side of the cabin to the other. The others were still asleep, their faces pale in the dim firelight. "Jack," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What?" "Listen." The footsteps stopped. "What are you talking about?" Jack asked, sitting up. Before I could answer, the sound came again, a slow, deliberate creak, followed by a faint scuffling noise, like something or someone moving just above us. "Probably just an animal," Jack said, though his voice lacked conviction. But then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the crackle of the fire. But as the minutes passed, they grew louder, closer, until it sounded like they were coming from just outside the cabin. Low, guttural murmurs, words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for us. Sarah woke next, followed by Emily. We huddled together, staring at the windows, their glass panes reflecting the flickering firelight. The whispers seemed to circle the cabin, rising and falling like some twisted song. "Someone's out there," Sarah said, her voice trembling. Jack grabbed the hatchet we'd brought for chopping firewood and moved toward the door. "Stay here," he said. "Don't," Emily pleaded. "What if it's an animal?" Jack cut in. "Then I'll scare it off." He opened the door, stepping out into the cold night. The whispers stopped instantly, replaced by an oppressive silence. We waited, the seconds stretching into an eternity. "Jack," I called out. No answer. When he finally returned, his face was pale, his hands trembling around the hatchet. "There's nothing out there," he said, though his voice suggested otherwise. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. The whispers returned, joined by faint scratching at the walls and the occasional thud from the roof. By the time dawn broke, we were exhausted, our nerves frayed. That's when we noticed the door. It was locked. The realization hit us like a punch to the gut. We'd never locked the door. It didn't even have a proper lock, just a simple latch on the inside. But now it wouldn't budge, no matter how hard we pushed or pulled. "What the hell?" Jack muttered, his voice cracking. We turned to the windows, hoping to climb out, but they wouldn't open either. The glass was cold to the touch, frost creeping across its surface despite the fire still burning in the hearth. And then we saw the footprints. They were just outside the cabin, circling it in a chaotic pattern. Some were small, almost childlike, while others were enormous, far larger than any human foot. They led to and from the door, the windows, even the roof. But there was no sign of anyone or anything around. We eventually broke the latch and fled, leaving the cabin behind without a second glance. When we finally found the trail and made it back to civilization, we tried to convince ourselves it was all in our heads. But none of us could explain the footprints, the whispers, or the locked door. I've thought about going back, about finding that cabin again and proving to myself that it was just an old house in the woods. But something tells me that if I do, I might not make it out a second time. Story number 4. The companion on the trail. I've always loved hiking at night. There's something about the solitude, the way the forest transforms under the moonlight, that makes you feel like you're walking through another world. It's not for everyone. Most people are put off by the darkness, the isolation, but for me, it's a kind of therapy, or at least it was. It was late October when it happened. I decided to tackle a trail in the Blue Ridge Mountains, one I'd hiked dozens of times before. It wasn't particularly challenging, but it was beautiful, especially under the light of a full moon. I packed my gear, left the car at the trailhead, and set off just as the last light of day faded from the horizon. The first few miles were peaceful, the crunch of leaves under my boots the only sound. The air was crisp and cool, the kind of night that makes you feel alive. I just passed the midpoint of the trail when I saw him. He appeared out of nowhere, a man standing just off the path, as though he'd been waiting for me. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with a weathered face and sharp, pale eyes that seemed to catch the moonlight. He wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long coat that looked more suited to another century. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat. His voice was deep and calm, carrying easily through the stillness of the forest. "Evening," I replied, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. It wasn't unusual to see other hikers on the trail, but at this hour, alone, it was strange, to say the least. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" he asked. There was something about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that made me hesitate. But his smile was disarming, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to have some company. "Sure," I said. "I'm heading toward the ridge." He nodded, falling into step beside me. At first, our conversation was light. He told me his name was Thomas, and that he'd been hiking these mountains since he was a boy. His voice had a soothing, almost hypnotic quality, and I found myself relaxing as we talked. He had a way of making you feel like you'd known him forever, even though we'd just met. But as the miles passed, something about him started to nag at me. It wasn't anything he said. Exactly, he was polite, even friendly, but there was an oddness to him. He never stumbled on the uneven terrain, never seemed out of breath, even as we climbed the steeper parts of the trail. And his eyes, they were so pale they almost didn't look real, like they belonged to something that had spent too much time in the dark. "You hike this trail often?" I asked, trying to shake off the unease creeping into my chest. "Used to," he said, his gaze fixed straight ahead. "Haven't been here in a long time, though. Feels good to walk it again." I nodded, though his words didn't make much sense. The way he moved, the way he spoke, it was like he belonged here in a way I never could, like the forest was his, and I was just passing through. We reached a fork in the trail just as the moon disappeared behind a cloud. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. Thomas stopped, his eyes scanning the path ahead. "This is where I leave you," he said, his voice softer now. I frowned. "You're not heading to the ridge?" He shook his head. "No, I've got somewhere else to be." I glanced at the fork, then back at him. "Which way are you going?" Instead of answering, he raised his hand and pointed straight ahead, not down either of the trails, but into the dense, shadowy woods. "That's not a trail," I said, my voice tinged with confusion. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It is for me." Before I could say another word, he turned and stepped into the trees. The forest swallowed him up, the sound of his footsteps fading almost instantly. I stood there, frozen, my breath fogging in the icy air. And then I felt it, a chill that went deeper than the cold. A sense of wrongness so profound it made my skin crawl. The woods were too quiet, the stillness unnatural. I called out his name, my voice shaking, but there was no response. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the darkness where he'd disappeared. Eventually, I forced myself to move, turning back toward the ridge. But the feeling of being watched stayed with me, a constant weight on my back. Every rustle of leaves, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye, made my heart race. When I finally reached the ridge, the moon had returned, bathing the landscape in its cold, silver light. I stopped to catch my breath, trying to shake the lingering unease. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. They started at the edge of the trail and led straight to the precipice, where they stopped abruptly. I knelt down, shining my flashlight on the tracks. They were fresh, the impressions deep and clear in the soft dirt. But there was no sign of anyone. I stared at the empty space beyond the edge, my mind racing. The footprints didn't make sense. They didn't lead back into the forest or down the trail. They just ended. I left the mountain that night, my nerves frayed, my thoughts spiraling. I told myself it was a trick of the light, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I knew better. A few weeks later, I mentioned the encounter to a ranger at the park office. His face grew serious as I described Thomas. His pale eyes, his old-fashioned clothes. "You're not the first to see him," the ranger said quietly. "People have been talking about a man like that for decades. Always appears at night, always on that trail. Some say he was a logger who died in the forest back in the 1800s. Others say he was a hiker who got lost and never made it out. But the thing is," he paused, his gaze meeting mine, "no one ever sees him twice. I haven't been back to the Blue Ridge Mountains since. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I think about Thomas. I think about his pale eyes, his strange smile, and the way he disappeared into the woods. And I wonder if, somewhere out there, he's still walking that trail, waiting for his next companion." Story number 5. The light in the woods. Camping was supposed to be our escape. After weeks of city life grinding us down, Sarah and I decided to pack up and head into the woods for the weekend. We wanted quiet, fresh air, and the kind of starlit nights that remind you how small you are in the universe. The forest near Bear Creek was perfect, remote but not too far from civilization, with a handful of trails and a clearing by the river that seemed tailor-made for a tent. We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low behind the towering pines. The air was crisp, carrying the faint, earthy scent of damp leaves and pine needles. We set up camp quickly, pitching the tent and building a small fire. By nightfall, we were sitting under a canopy of stars, the flames crackling softly between us. It should have been perfect. The first sign of something unusual came just after dinner. We were sitting by the fire, the sound of the river a soothing backdrop to our conversation, when Sarah stopped mid-sentence. Her eyes were fixed on the treeline. "Do you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I turned to look and saw it, a faint light, like a lantern, bobbing slowly between the trees. At first, I thought it was another camper, maybe someone who'd gotten lost. But as we watched, the light moved in an unsettling way, too smooth, too deliberate. It didn't flicker like a lantern or flashlight would. It just glowed, steady and cold, weaving silently through the forest. "Hello," I called out, standing up. "Do you need help?" The light paused for a moment, as if it had heard me. Then it moved again, faster now, darting between the trees like it was trying to draw us in. Sarah grabbed my arm. "Don't," she said, her voice tense. "Something's not right." but curiosity got the better of me. "It's probably just someone out for a walk," I said, grabbing my flashlight. "Stay here. I'll check it out." The forest swallowed me whole the moment I stepped off the trail. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches weaving together to block out the stars. The ground was soft and uneven, my boots crunching on twigs and leaves as I moved toward the light. I stayed just out of reach, bobbing further into the woods whenever I got close. My flashlight barely seemed to cut through the darkness, the beam swallowed by the oppressive black around me. The further I went, the colder it got, the air biting at my skin despite the layers I wore. "Hey!" I called again, louder this time. "If you need help, say something." No answer, just the soft crunch of my own footsteps and the eerie silence that seemed to press against my ears. And then the light disappeared. The sudden darkness was jarring, my flashlight the only thing keeping the void at bay. My breath came in quick, visible puffs as I turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest for any sign of movement. "Sarah?" I called, my voice shaking. A twig snapped behind me, and I spun around, the flashlight beam catching nothing but trees and shadows. The forest felt alive now, watching, waiting. I backed up slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it, a low, guttural sound, halfway between a growl and a whisper. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer, until it seemed to be all around me. I broke into a run, the light from my flashlight bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. When I finally burst into the clearing, Sarah was standing by the fire, her face pale and drawn. "What happened?" she demanded, grabbing my arm. "You've been gone for almost an hour." I shook my head, struggling to catch my breath. The light, it disappeared. She didn't ask any more questions. She just doused the fire, her hands trembling, and we climbed into the tent, zipping it tight behind us. I don't think either of us slept that night. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it strange, almost human sounds. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps circling the tent, but when I mustered the courage to look outside, there was nothing there. Morning couldn't come fast enough. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we emerged from the tent, the cold air biting at our faces. That's when we saw the footprints. They were everywhere, crisscrossing the clearing in erratic patterns. Some were large, too large to be human, while others were small and delicate, like a child's. They surrounded the tent, leading to and from the treeline, but there was no sign of anyone or anything nearby. We packed up in record time, the unease in the pit of my stomach growing with every passing second. As we hiked back to the car, the forest felt different, the air heavier, the silence oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We didn't talk much on the drive home. Neither of us wanted to admit what we were thinking, that whatever we'd seen, whatever had left those footprints, wasn't something we could explain. It's been months now, but I still dream about that light. I see it moving through the trees, cold and silent, drawing me in. And in those dreams, I never make it back to the clearing. I follow the light until the darkness swallows me whole. And I can't help but wonder if one day I'll see it again, not in a dream, but outside my window, bobbing gently, waiting for me to follow.